Hey, it's Theo. Sorry for the wait. I've been unwell and. Hold on, I have something way more important than I call for interviews and guests. Turn this shit off. Ear protection during concerts is very important. Since you never know how loud the sound mix will be, it's arguably non negotiable, even if you think you'll be fine. You only have one set of ears, and hearing loss from loud noise is irreversible. Tinnitus / permanent ringing in the ears can range from annoying to life-ruining, and you don't want to settle for annoying. That being said, almost 40 concerts in, I am not someone who has been responsible with ear protection. The foam plugs you can get for free or cheap at venues never worked for me. They're thick and slippery and made for larger ear canals than I have. When they fit, the sound of a show gets flattened into a muddy paste, and the physical loudness of the music gets so lost, I might as well listen to an album on dollar store earbuds and save some money. Why pay an extra buck or two to make the concert actively worse? This episode is unintentionally about my last few concerts without ear protection. I bought reusable silicone earplugs from Earproof earlier, not sponsored, and they alleviated most of my issues with the cheap stuff when I tested them out at home. I was excited for a field test and a product review, but I forgot the earplugs before heading into Boston, more on that at the end. It was wildly irresponsible. It's not something I want listeners walking away thinking was okay, at least when I did it. Make better choices than me, especially if you're seeing Goddamn Primitive Man, and they get their test drive soon, I promise. Thank you, and on to the show. Welcome to the Nausea River podcast. I'm Theo Morgan, and while I'm not the life of the party is in fact my life. Also, I spent a lot of time emphasizing the importance of supporting local acts. I still stand by it, but the closest I got on September 14th and 15th were absolutely random encounters with members of local bands. And those were only facilitated when my tastes going a little more international. Say it ain't so, I'll drop lots of money to see a band from Norway or Belgium perform live. Or Denver if you want to get really spicy. I'm content with not having a solid brand here yet. Is this a show about local music or just my own tastes? Is it about my adventures in Boston and the crazy soundtrack to them? It could be that. We're not even 4 episodes in. Let's see where our strongest material comes from. So with that being said, this is the story about my crazy 3 concerts in a row weekend, the first of a few to come. And it starts with me cutting out almost all of the first one. I saw the Lemonheads at the Paradise Rock Club on September 13th, with my mother in tow as a last-minute guest. I dropped my extra stuff off at my parents' house for safekeeping, and we were on the road to Boston. She had been nagging me about ear protection for a while, but even though I dropped $50 on high-quality reusable earplugs, they somehow never traveled with me to Boston. Must have left them at work. But I spent a lot of money on tickets to the Lemonheads, thanks Live Nation, and the show must go on. As one of Boston's hometown heroes with some serious bops, the Lemonheads put on a fun show that we watched from a spot in the mezzanine. But it turned out that the topic of shows with my parents would make a better standalone episode, a palate cleanser from me giving you all the intentional heavy metal poisoning. After a good night's sleep in my mom's guest room, a new day dawned. Saturday was Leprous at the Sinclair, and 2 mysterious opening acts. Sunday was Amun-Ra with Primitive Man and Blackwater Holy Light at the Middle East downstairs. The latter, a pilgrimage for doom metal fans and the clinically depressed. The former, a bit more of an enigma. I almost bailed on the show too. Melodies of Atonement, released a scant 2 weeks before the show, was good but not great, but eventually realized that $50 is a lot of money even in 2024. That's groceries for a week for me. I can be frugal too sometimes, so the show must go on. And it was time to make the most of it. Despite a brief obsession with their music several years ago, I never interacted with the Leprous fan base. I heard about them from a guy at the Devin Townsend and Haken concert in early 2020, but Devin Townsend fans are all over the place. People like me who are still sad that he ended strapping young lad, devoted progressive metal fans, and possibly some people who are barely metalheads at all. I truly can't imagine the shock on someone's face if they got into that man's music through Ghost or Casualties of Cool, and they have to face Love and March of the Poozers back to back. I don't think that sort of whiplash is there for Leprous, even if they've moved away from metal on their other albums. The weekend begins in earnest on a train ride to Porter Station. Nothing runs on time, but we have plenty to spare. I wander around Somerville and Cambridge, wherever my feet will take me, really, until I'm running out of ideas. My belly is full of rice from Kosher Mama in Somerville, and I'm tired of lugging around a backpack. and then I get lost my way to the Sinclair, located in the thick of Harvard Square. My sense of direction is pretty poor, and Google routing me through the quad of Harvard University doesn't help me at all. Eventually, I found 3 young men in familiar shirts, like a lighthouse in the fog for metalheads. One was a Haken Tour shirt, no surprises there. The other was for alt-rock metalcore comedy band Bill Murray. The band formed from the ashes of Attack Attack. You truly don't know what a Leprous fan looks like. I followed them to the queue, which was longer than I expected, starting to wrap around the block. Who told the masses about Leprous anyways? I thought I was special for knowing about them, and now my coveted front spot at the concert was in jeopardy. It at least made for good people watching, and at metal shows I mostly just care about shirts. Although I was wrapped up in a very large flannel overshirt, I was also repping Boston area avant-garde metal, jazz fusion, and goth rock legends K.O. Dot. Just take my word for it. They moved to New York, but as much as I worship the ground that multi-instrumentalist Toby Driver even strums a chord on, I won't let them forget their roots. There were shirts for Devin Townsend, Haken, multiple Bill Murray shirts as it turns out, shirts for Tesseract, Dream Theater, Opeth, Sleep Token, and the guy I respect the most, the guy repping frequent Leprous collaborator, Ishan. I wish that I talked to him more. The only other time I went to the Sinclair was this past June to see Pallbearer. Even though I was quote-unquote late that evening and the doors were already open, Pallbearer drew in a smaller crowd and the main venue space was almost empty. It was even easy to get a cup of tonic water at the bar, which was already packed by the time I got in for the Leprous show. I don't necessarily want to spend all my time revisiting past shows, but Pallbearer was also a perfect fit for the venue. The Sinclair hosts a variety of bands, but I always see it as a bit of a pretentious place. Always kept super dark even before showtime, with ceramic tiles on the bottom and an elaborate mezzanine layout above. And in that space, Pallbearer's crushing yet epic doom metal filled the space and power washed the dirt off my troubled soul. All in all, it seemed like the perfect venue for Leprous, too. Lofty music that's certainly metal, but you shouldn't mosh to it either. Don't let the anxiety get the best of you at a concert. While much of the crowd was busy getting merch or drinks, I skipped both and got my dream position right up front at center stage. It was my dream position for Leprous anyways. I still had to stand through the opening acts, Fight the Fight, and The World is a Beautiful Place, and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. Yeah, one band name. They replaced Monuments on this whole tour, not like I had any strong opinion on them either. I will not spend too long on the openers this time. Sometimes an opener is like The Kills, or Health, or Good Friends Old as Sea. Those bands who instantly become a favorite and they almost overshadow their headliner. Sometimes it's pretty bad, but I won't name names there. But as an aside, I hate every meme about going up to the bar for the openers. They're still working hard. It's like a 40-minute set. Shut the fuck up and give a polite golf clap. But that's unrelated for the night of the 14th. Fight the Fight and The World is a Beautiful Place were actually very enjoyable live. Fight the Fight play metalcore, and The World has the math rock subreddit arguing if they're math rock or just quirky emo. In fact, I'd say I never knew where The World would go next, and it was awesome. Lots of tempo changes, multiple vocalists harmonizing, all that good stuff. It sounded very math rock to me. The inclusion of a female vocalist almost gave me Rollo Tomasi vibes. Now, there's an act I'd like to see on a bill with Leprous. In between sets, I ended up talking to people next to me. After a creepy drunk guy wandered off to the bar and lost his place, I was surrounded by good company only. What is a Leprous fan? Well, they like other progressive metal. The man to my left, not drunk thankfully, excitedly shared plans to see Amorphous, Opeth, and Zeal and Ardor live later, 3 shows I knew I'd be at too. The first 2 bands are longtime favorites from back when I was a teenager. Was this a show to heal a teenage Theo? Not really, considering I first discovered these guys well into my 20s, but she would have savored every concert she could get her skinny butt to. As I said, I almost skipped this concert, but I had been to concerts for bands that gave me recent mixed feelings before. My literal first concert was Nightwish and Sonata Arctica, after all. Dark Passion Play and Unia were fresh off the press and certainly not perfect. Both bands played setlists heavy on newer material, and it was the best night of my life for a while, so let the lights dim and think about nothing but a good time. The band crowds the stage. Leprous are a sextet live, drummer, bassist, 2 guitarists, live keyboardist, and the legend himself, singer Einar Solberg. He handles keyboards in the studio, just to be clear, but doesn't want to be chained to his instrument for the whole show. On the record, Einar Solberg is certainly not a weak singer. He has an impressive range, but it's the more delicate falsetto moments that stick with me. It's easy to picture a man that matches the voice, vulnerable and not particularly tall. The other feature of note in the Sinclair is its high stage. For reference, I am 5'5" once I stop slouching, and for the rest of the world, 166 centimeters. This is what I think justifies my need to be at the front of the crowd, obviously. But keeping that in mind, the ledge of the Sinclair stage reaches my clavicle when I'm standing right in front of it, instead of other stages that are, to be crass, ass height or lower. For one, it does mean a better sight line even for those in the middle or back of the crowd, as long as you can look up. But if you're on stage, almost 5 feet above everyone else, you're no longer just a person with a guitar. You look a little taller. This is true for the opening acts as well, but Leprous took it further with a few step stool-like platforms, including one right in front of me. Einar Solberg turns out to be a towering man, at least 190 centimeters tall, dressed in black and staring down at the crowd with his piercing blue eyes. He doesn't smile much, whether due to stage training or some variety of Nordic coldness. Even his stage banter, while friendly to us, was low-key and even a little sarcastic. While singing, Solberg would often stand on the platform right in front of me, and despite having to look up into his crotch half the time, the other half was seeing his intense glare between verses, and I felt overpowered. Obviously, the rest of his band aren't slouches either. They brought my favorite part of Leprous to the live setting that I feared would disappear, the tight, almost cold performance that seems lifted from their friend Ishan. They could have played looser with the format, or jammed out too much, or, God forbid, got too drunk on stage. But the craft of keeping studio levels of control without making the show redundant is a tricky one for sure. They kept what separates Leprous from a lot of progressive metal for me, even at their most frustrating. And speaking of frustrating, they did indeed play a lot of Melodies of Atonement, but even weaker picks for me like Unfree My Soul and Like a Sunken Ship sounded much better live, fuller and easier to feel with the oily polish wiped away. And they had the good sense to play Faceless, at least, my song of the year, but not really, but I'm not revealing my actual picks yet either. In my review of the album, I didn't explain what Faceless sounded like. It starts with a jazz-inspired piano and bass line, slow, and the singing heavily relying on Solberg's falsetto range, and it ends with a choir joining him. I thought it'd be a perfect audience sing-along moment, but never pin all your concert hopes and dreams on it either. They brought 6 fans on stage instead, forming the Leprous fan choir. And I wasn't enough of a fan for it, biggest regret of my life. One of the 6 fans was actually a woman I was talking to in between sets. I wasn't able to get her for spoken comments. I know everyone's busy these days, including me. But she did explain the process in an Instagram comment, which was very nice of her. You were selected and vetted well before the concert date. The 6 winners, so to speak, went to the venue early to run through the song and stage blocking during sound check. They would have to discreetly exit the crowd during a certain song in the set list so they could enter from backstage. And then showtime, if a brief one. It's not a terribly long part of Faceless after all. From my vantage point, it was pure fucking magic for one of my new favorite songs too. And I hope I made a new concert friend. I was starstruck seeing her on stage. When I exit a show at the Sinclair, I tend to have a lot of energy. The high stage probably lets a lot of sound pass over my head instead of pounding my eardrum. You feel good enough that you want to brush off the earplug wearers as a bunch of softies. I was able to say my goodbyes to new concert buddies and make out all the words, and even briefly talk to Leprous's touring keyboardist Harrison White. With minimal tinnitus, I had the energy, confidence, and post-concert joy to try and walk the mile or so back to my Airbnb as the storefronts in Harvard Square began to dim. But in the end, I still got super lost. Hey, just a moment. We'll be right back to the episode soon. But are you a musician? Do you work behind the scenes instead, or do you just have a cool story to tell? Nausea River is always looking for interview subjects and guests. I don't bite, and I'm a lot more loose and funny without a script, I promise. Check out our description for our social media and contact info if you're interested. Thanks a ton, and on to the rest of the show. I didn't sleep a wink on Saturday night, by the way. Let's not get into details. Wide awake and bright-eyed, I wandered around Somerville at sunrise, enjoying some mama leak in uniform as the sky gave way to a fuzzy pink glow. My day, fueled by adrenaline and my last remaining vice, caffeine and energy drinks, was exciting, but maybe only to me. I got a croissant and napped on the banks of the Charles River, but not really for that long. There's always a lot of time to kill before a show. I spent hours at lunch with a friend, and he headed off to the Middle East to see Greenlung and Castle Rat. Not where I was going, and boy, it was a hard decision on my behalf. It was an odd night booked for the complex and its various venues. A bunch of bands arrived in Boston right after their spots at Desert Fest NYC. I've never been to it, but the lineup is what Summer Gloom would do if they had money. Lots of members of the doom metal family meeting up for 2 nights, the heaviest sets imaginable. I might try to make it work next year if the lineup is solid enough. But it meant that Boston greeted Amon-Ra, Primitive Man, Blackwater Holy Light, and somehow Greenlung, with barely an hour of breathing room. I can't imagine that the fan bases for those bands are particularly different after all. There is a double feature bundle you could buy, but you'd ultimately have to sacrifice an act or two to make it work. At the end of the day, I love Primitive Man more than Greenlung, and their sets intersected to some degree. That hurts to say. Expectations were high, but there was a twist that me and my naked ears should have foreseen. 4 episodes in, and it might feel like I enjoy every live act I see, and I'll admit I do my damnedest to get my money's worth out of it. I have situations far worse than being skeptical about how good an album sounds live. Plus, maybe I just have superior taste. Even without that, I'll find the pleasure and talent in genres and bands that I tend not to seek out otherwise. So what happens when a band I already like disappointed? Well, I still blame myself for it. The lights dimmed at the Middle East, and much of my view was of a large speaker at stage right. Blackwater Holy Light from Portland, Oregon, entered the stage. On the record, Blackwater Holy Light play a low-key, crowd-pleasing blend of psych rock and stoner metal. They're also one of my dad's favorite new bands in 2018, long before I discovered them. Comprised of 4 ladies, you only really notice the breezy vocals of frontwoman Alison Ferris until you see them live. There's no gender to drumming, for instance. Unlike a lot of doom metal and stoner-adjacent bands, I wouldn't describe them as particularly heavy or crushing or even loud in their most intense moments. It's not a thick cloud of bong smoke, but a refreshing mist as you walk through the Pacific Northwest forests. Blackwater Holy Light are honestly a bit of an odd placement next to Primitive Man and Amon-Ra in that regard, but a good show is a good show, and live footage of Blackwater Holy Light shows that they tend to sound wonderful. If you're up for it, I recommend their set at the dearly departed St. Vitus Bar from 2019. I linked it in the description. So what happened with them? If you've never been to the Middle East downstairs, let me describe the space. It's a large open room that fits a hair under 600 people. Comparable in size to the Sinclair or Brighton Music Hall, it lacks the mezzanine of the Sinclair and the 2 enclaves of Brighton. It's all one level, much longer than it is wide, and with a particularly low ceiling. Now I'm out of my depth when the conversation drifts towards the technical aspects of music, acoustics, or physics. I'm just a writer at the end of the day. But if I had to guess, the sound has to travel to the back somehow. I've been towards the back of the crowd at the Middle East before, and never noticed anything too amiss with the loudness. It honestly sounded great, though admittedly the sightlines that venues suck ass due to the length and low stage height. Interesting for a place in the same complex as Upstairs and Sonia, which have great sightlines. I thought about the sightlines when I went to the front, knowing I had been there with unprotected ears before. It sounded acceptable for Morged and horrendous, didn't it? Blackwater Holy Light started the first song, bringing on onslaught of indiscernible mud. The vocals and keyboards may as well not have been in the mix at all, and it wasn't like the rest sounded any good either. Yet, I don't want to blame the band. I blame the venue's layout, sure, but I blame myself for the front spot I chose too. The very worst place in front of a speaker, instead of trying to squeeze in closer to the center, or, God forbid, swallowing my pride and moving further back. And as my ears hurt from the impenetrable wall of noise, I knew that my biggest mistake was forgetting my earplugs. I don't know if they could have separated the sonic layers out for me or not. Maybe it still would have hurt, but only hurt my soul. When the set wrapped up, I felt miserable, pummeled by sound, ears crackling, and the lack of sleep finally hitting me a little bit too. And if that's what they could do to Blackwater Holy Light, Primitive Man would give me permanent hearing loss. Blackwater Holy Light can seduce you before the guitar's distortion amps up, but Primitive Man's music is a wall of sound from start to finish. Any album of theirs being a relentless 40 minutes or more of sludgy, death-doom anger, bitterness, and sheer misanthropy, whether you hear it live or through a set of cheap earbuds from the gas station. On stage, vocalist and guitarist Ethan Lee McCarthy does not look at the audience directly at all. He faces the side, tall enough for his shiny bald head to almost scrape the ceiling. His bellowing vocals aren't an illusion created by studio magic. He is every bit as loud and menacing up close, or as close as I could get. I was a few rows of people back, and Primitive Man still ranked as the second loudest show I've been to yet. It didn't make my bones hurt like sleep did, but my throat started to shake and burn. But what other volume should their music be played at? It's the sort of music that should actively make you feel worse, or at least less thrilled about your life. Describing themselves as the world's first and only death sludge act, first, I think that's just a bit presumptuous. Those genres work together really well. And the Metal Archive shows a few hundred bands listed under those two genres. And it also flattens the experience, removing aspects like the industrial and noise samples throughout their set, the key to selling their anger and hatred even at a slow pace. But for skeptics, mostly of the metalhead variety, it's not all dirges for 20 minutes at a time either. Primitive Man are at their best and the pace picks up. Frantically fretting his guitar, McCarthy looks seconds away from strangling the closest person to him. If only I had the protection to see it up close and not make an episode about the last thing I ever heard being Primitive Man. Not the worst choice if I had to, I guess. When I stopped being hard on myself, Primitive Man were the easy highlight of the night. There was nothing else I expected from a Primitive Man show. The feeling of being inside a hydraulic press and all the nasty feelings you would have in that state. McCarthy didn't have a word of onstage banter besides ending with a goodbye to us. I've never heard an actual bad word about the guys behind Primitive Man, for the record. But even if he was a little affable on stage, I don't know what I'd think. Probably as bad as Blackwater Holy Light's sound being smushed into a fine paste. Walking in, my lowest expectations were in fact for the headliners. Amon Ra are a classic of the sludge, hardcore, and post-metal scene. All of their mass albums are heartbreaking but unafraid to build up to a final outburst with each song. Some of my favorites of the genre, and required listening for everyone from metalheads to goths to emos who need insoles in their Converses. And then the more recent De Doorn and Skunk bore me to tears. No build-up, no payoff for the quiet heartbreak each song starts with. Inessential listening, honestly. The latter is a film soundtrack, sure, but what is De Doorn's excuse? Being leftovers? That's probably it. As their most recent Normal album, I feared the set list would be heavy with it. Maybe the songs would translate better live, and maybe I would just call this the Primitive Man headlining show in my memories. Amon Ra are a band, but there is a layer of lore to them, especially with the mass albums. To be honest, I only ever paid attention to the music, at least when it's good. Regardless of what I think, the live show becomes a ritual. Frontman Colin Van Eekhout performing not for us, but for someone else. His back to the audience for most of the show. In interviews, he has talked about the curiosity he's always had about religion, including Christianity. I wouldn't class Amon Ra as a Christian metal band, however. I know my Catholic mother is listening to this with a keen grimace on her face. But on the other hand, it does remind me of people who convert to Catholicism just for the ritual and showmanship of Mass. To my delight, Amon Ra stuck to their best material and created my dream set list, pretty much. The only pick off De Doorn was De Evenmens, which is actually a much better and more intense song live. I gotta hand that one to them. Each song had a unique video projected onto the screen in back of them, which gave something to watch, even to those cursed with a bad vantage point, such as myself. It was a little sad to almost never see half the band over everyone else's head, but I figured that Van Eekhout was supposed to be the star, looking genuinely anguished as he screamed the often stream of consciousness lyrics to the songs. Ripped the shirt off his back twice, he was wearing 2 layers. He is a fantastic presence on stage, betraying his roots in hardcore by having the same intensity as the best in that genre. Being a few rows of people back for Amon Ra was the sonic sweet spot, at least for my situation. Amon Ra go hot and cold, fast and slow. It's what makes post-metal better than just pretentious doom metal. So nothing was too quiet, and too loud was only for my inner ears, not my heart or bones. But I still don't know what their drummer looks like. That would be the end of it, your host learning a valuable lesson, but there's always a little thread to tie it up. My ears rang on the way home, perhaps trying to give me a lullaby to finally doze off to. I didn't sleep well that night either, suffering from half an earache and half a headache, but it was at least an improvement. Maybe it begs the question, why do concerts like this if they run me ragged? I'd probably still feel like shit even if I slept like a baby after the Leprous show. It's not cheap either, but even if these shows were free or gave press passes to new podcasters, it's a physical task that borders on feeling like actual exercise. My friends lightly joke about my habits. I think they're really funny too. Concerts every weekend with bands they've never heard of being pared down to 45-second clips in my Instagram stories. Of course, they all go to concerts too, just not as often and in far larger venues. They won't stand around with me for 3 hours at the Middle East upstairs with 50 other dweebs. Why so extreme then? Do casual joggers ask marathon runners that? I think my brother listens to this podcast anyways. He just finished his second marathon, and we politely nod along as the other recounts their crazy weekend. Anyways, I felt appropriately sluggish and nihilistic the morning after the show. A restless weekend's antics had caught up with me. No drinks for me anymore, but the under-eye circles and blotchy skin of my old drinking days had come back anyways. A fine static still hissed in my ears, and I barely registered how much the family dogs were barking. That is to say, this is the only way to feel after a doom metal show, and I can't wait to do it again. My jeans hadn't been touched all weekend due to the warm weather, and never traveled with me to Boston, instead staying in my parents' guest room all weekend. But for work, they would suffice and didn't smell bad yet. I put them on and felt 2 lumps in my pocket. One was a flash drive that held some interview audio for another podcast episode. Sucks, but I got a lot of the scripted bits done during downtime without it. The other cold, cylindrical item was deep in a fold, but I fished it out eventually. It was my fucking earplugs! Okay, so 2 bonuses. Right as everyone was leaving the Sinclair, I had an awkward fangirl moment with Nate Edelman from the Salem-based art rock / folk metal band 1476. Big fan of these guys. I seem to mention them all the time here. He's their guitarist, and he is so funny live. I saw them in May, and he just mugged the audience the whole time. I was having a bad night, but put a huge smile on my face. I gave him a hug, and said I was really excited for their show at Ralph's Diner on October 20th. Tickets are low, but please go if you can. It's actually a really early show by metal standards. The other one was when I was walking through Coolidge Corner in Boston the next day. I was in my Summer Gloom 2024 t-shirt and really hoped someone at the Amon-Ra show would recognize it. But this was before that. It was broad daylight, and this young, heavily tattooed blonde guy says, "Cool shirt." I asked if he went to day 2 of Summer Gloom like I did, and you bet he did because he was the fucking bassist for the Infinity Ring. No joke, I looked at pictures of their set from Desert Fest NYC, and it wasn't someone trying to pull a prank on me. His name's Andy. He's super nice. He actually left a lot of his stuff in New York that weekend, and best of all, he was happy to get a Nausea River business card. If you're listening to this, Andy, yes, I will turn every chance encounter into content. Keep the card so you can sell it when I get popular. Your band's great, and I won't beg for an interview, but I'll gently ask.